Welcome to Redeeming the Time. We are doing a bonus episode for you guys, like we said a few times in the last episode.
Had a sound effect.
We're going to be talking about what happened in between Malachi and Matthew. So as we were studying Matthew, as we said a few times last week, there were some cultural, political things that happened in between this time. And when you learn it, it opens a new understanding of just things that were going on in the Gospels. So we thought it was important to go over that. And we brought Scott on here with us because for me personally, he was one of the ones that encouraged me to dive more into this. And when I did, it brought a whole new life to the Gospels. And he has been teaching on Matthew for a while in the Cornerstone class. So. But I do dedicate your appreciation and your dedication to the book of Matthew and this topic in particular. So we're going to dive into it. And
welcome back.
Yes.
Back.
Yeah.
Jacob says we're not allowed to talk about any subjects, so he's whipping us there. So this is known as the silent years. It's typically, if you read something, that's what it's called. I was talking with the guys ahead of time, so we're bringing you up to the Gospels, and for the Gospels to flourish quickly, there was a need for several things, and these are the three that I have down. You guys add in easier access to larger groups of people, meaning trade routes, roads had to be in place. A common language so that you could easily disseminate that information, and then a common culture. And so we're going to see how those things come about. Would you add any of that?
Yeah, no, that's spot on. And like we said, Galatians says at just the right time. So God sent forth His Son. So absolutely,
in the fullness of time.
Yeah, all this stuff.
So, we've gone through the different empires, and I think that was the start of it. We were talking before, Assyria really started that ball rolling with these empires. We had some commonality. Things started to grow. And then it comes to the next empire, and we've got Babylon. It does it even more. And then the Medes, each of them take the land of the other one, and they continue to grow it and continue to grow it. Well, something happens. In 486 BC, Darius' son in the Mede-Persian Empire, Ahasuerus, or Xerxes the First, Ahasuerus of Esther, he becomes king, and he goes after Greece. He goes across the sea, and he sacks Athens. Later, he loses a major naval battle to them, but this sort of awakens Greece. And over the next few Persian kings, they spend time fighting with Greece and with Egypt, who are in revolt. And there's a guy named Philip II, king of Macedon, and he's been the king in Greece, and he dies suddenly. And his 20-year-old son, named Alexander, comes to power. Alexander the Great, the giant of culture. If you go to Greece, his statue is everywhere. I mean, he is our guide while we were on that trip. She thinks he is the greatest leader of all time, and
he's one of the best.
He's tops up there. 334 BC, so that's where we find ourselves. He invades the Persian Empire. Darius III is king. He's actually, his wife was more of the kingly lineage, and he comes in as power. He wins a few battles, but Darius is eventually killed by his own men. Alexander, this very young ruler, in 13 years takes over Asia Minor. He goes down to Egypt and finally into Persia. And he goes as far as modern-day Afghanistan. So I say all that to introduce this next topic. The effect of his conquest is very significant. It brought with it the term Hellenism. You guys want to explain Hellenism, what that word means?
I think just before we go into that, the God sovereignty, if you with with all these nations, and it brought them all together, like we're about to go into.
Yeah.
But you see in Habakkuk, he questions God of, why are you not bringing this judgment down?
Mm-hmm.
And well, God was working to do this, to fulfill those three things, the trade routes and all that. So he tells Habakkuk to step back, look at what I'm doing in these other nations. And that was the start of it with the Assyrians and Babylon. And now it's continued with the Persians, and now Greece, which then we get into Hellenism.
Yeah, without a doubt, God's sovereignty is seen through this, that he is preparing the way for the Christ to be to come. And one of those ways is a term we call Hellenism. Go ahead.
Yeah. So Hellenism is the Romans had their word for Greece was Hellas.
Yeah.
So Hellenism is the term they've coined, but we've adopted, right, that talks about the cultural influence of Greek philosophy in the Greek culture as well. Like when you evaluate where they were, like we have built a lot of our things in our country politically, even structurally to some degree, like based off that Greek and modified Roman philosophy of way things work. Well, that philosophy is what governs a lot of their influence over where man is in society versus where the gods are, right? Especially when you read through the Old Testament, you see Yahweh, don't have any other gods before me. I'm going to go have a showdown with the gods of Egypt here on Passover in Exodus 12. He's going against the gods of Babylon. Like, you see all of this language about that because in the ancient Near East, that's what, deities, but depending on your culture, was at the center of your culture. Well, Hellenism comes in and says, no, man is the measure of all things, the Greek philosopher Protagoras said. And so the gods kind of get pushed out to the fringes of society, and now man is seen as the pinnacle, right? And then there are four pillars that undergird this whole cultural structure. And you've got education, healthcare, athletics, entertainment, theater, and so all of those things start to have an influence on the culture. And while it's great for Greece, like Alexander the Great is not necessarily just dominating the world with standing armies. He's in his wake. He's leaving behind a culture where the Greek Empire yes, he's conquering, geopolitically, mm-hmm. but culturally more so. And arguably, that culture has never stopped.
Yeah, he won the minds and the hearts of people through that. So this period comes about, and he dreamed of this Greek culture and philosophy that permeated the new empires. And with that, there's a power shift from the east, where it has been through the Medes and through Babylon, and now it is shifted to the west. So a flow of merchandise, a flow of culture is occurring, and it affects Judaism. It affects Israel, mm-hmm. because these schools, these gymnasiums, every ancient city you go in over there, you will see these. They're still there. Young men that train both their body and their mind in the Greek ideals. And so people begin, you see merchandise, you see money, people begin to seek the skills to function in this new growing complexity of a world. And the individual cultures, here's the issue, the individual cultures begin to merge, and they start to lose their identity, a common language of Greek, and became needed for law, became needed for commerce. I mean, it's like English being the language around the world today. You go to these weird foreign countries, I don't mean weird, but a little small area of the world, and yet they know English because they want to trade, they want to make money. So we see a lot of this going on. And for Palestine, they're not, Israel's not wanting to lose their culture, and so we see some things come up with this. So Alexander dies suddenly, very young, in 323, and his vast empire splits up in the Diadochi, which are his successors. There's 4 main successors, and we talked about these last week. There's Ptolemy, Soter, I can't pronounce the other guy's name, Antigonus, and Seleucus. And so
What is that word again?
Diadochi. You like that word?
Yeah.
It's on the menu at Olive Garden.
Yeah. Get that with a little bit of Parmesan. It's good. All right. It's Greek, though. That doesn't make any sense. All right.
Even better.
Some feta.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
need
yeah.
some
There we
feta
go. There
on
we
it.
go. All right,
Yeah,
all right.
some olives. So we just offended a bunch of whole culture. So remember, Israel is right along there. It's a major trade route. This becomes a desired property between the two. We talked about this last week. Eventually, those four competing guys of Alexander, they become two. They conquer the other two. Ptolemy is in the south, and Seleucus is in the north. And so we have these now two empires. They're not quite empires,
So
but
it's Egypt and like Syria, right?
pretty
Those are
much,
the
yeah,
areas.
yeah. Ptolemaic rules based out of Egypt. He has Judea at first, Jerusalem, created great trade routes. He's had Greek cities all along those trade routes, synagogues in each of those cities. Now, here's some differences. Ptolemy's in Egypt. His people, mostly homogenous, right? Mm-hmm. He has more of a same culture because he's got this massive country of Egypt and around in the surrounding areas. He has defined borders, easier to defend. So he permits his kingdom to worship as their culture desired. Ptolemy sets up the high priest as the ruler in Jerusalem, and all the taxes are collected by the high priest, and they're paid through him. It's a nice gig, right? So all of this goes until Onias II, under Ptolemy III, doesn't matter, refuses to pay tribute. So he's removed, and here's where it starts. He's removed, and he's replaced with a priest from Tobiah's family. We remember him from from the Nehemiah, the wealthy business guy. He's not of the priestly lineage. Boom, boom, boom. Here we got a problem. Mm-hmm. So this results in the position now being used as political, financial benefits, unrest among the Jews, and further Hellenization of Israel. So
what are the influences of Hellenism? What are further influences of Hellenism into the Jewish culture? So you talked about the synagogues and the chief priests and stuff, but what are some other ones if you want to dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, well, one of the a lot of it was based on what they felt would influence how they worship God, and so you'll find that within that world, whether it's in the synagogues or elsewhere, Jews that generally were more in favor of Hellenism or didn't have as big of a deal with it, their synagogues are generally going to be a little bit more ornate. You're going to see more artwork, architecture. There's detail to the ornateness of it. Whereas those that were like, nope, I don't like this Hellenism stuff, generally what you're going to find is very plain synagogues. There's not a lot of detail because that wasn't the point. And so it really just, it boils down to, yes, they're going to have to deal with it in everyday life, but it really just comes to how does this impact the way that we worship God and the way that the culture is telling us that our God is to operate, and whether or not we want to stand with what God says we should be or not.
Which we see today, too.
Which we see today.
Definitely.
Exactly.
All right, so now we're to the 200s, 200 BC, right around there. Seleucid kingdom grows. King Antiochus III, fourth and fifth Syrian wars. He's fighting against Ptolemy, and he gains control. He gets a victory over Israel by saying gain control. I'm talking about Israel. And they're all for it because a large tax burden was lifted off of them. Well, Antiochus's kingdom, it's the opposite of the Ptolemaic kingdom. His is more heterogeneous in mixture. He's got a lot of borders that he has to keep up. So he required conformity to a single culture, this Hellenization. So as Jacob was asking, he forces this. And if you cooperate, he rewards Israel by reducing their taxes. allowing some of their traditions. He actually starts repairing some of their temple. But this is really a short piece because he decides, bad timing, we talked about this last week, he decides to go and attack Greece. Why? Don't know. But he decides to go, and he has General Hannibal, the Carthage general, with him, and who had just wreaked havoc on Rome. So Rome is building in power during this time. And we have them go after Rome, and Rome fights back. And in 198, we're now to 190, at Magnesia, Rome stops Antiochus III. Mm-hmm. And this is a changing point for everyone because Rome's going to allow him to keep his power, but he's going to lose a great deal of finances. They require a massive sum from him to be able to keep his power. So where does he get that money from? He raids all the temples of anyone in his kingdom to gain this money. So that's where we stand with Antiochus. All right, so Antiochus is now awakened. The Roman Empire. It will continue to grow during this time. Let me just stop here for a second. We'll set up this next situation. If you have an old Bible or a Catholic Bible, there is a group of books between the Old Testament and the New Testament known as the Apocrypha. We don't accept it. Most Protestant churches. It lacks spiritual or scriptural integrity. It's inconsistent and lacks agreement with the rest of the canon of Scripture. So but it is a great source of Jewish tradition and history, which is going to set up this next period. That's the only reason I'm mentioning this, the Maccabean wars that are going to come about. So with this situation, Antiochus now starts raiding the temples after this attack, and in exchange for letting him go, he's got this big sum of money. Well, he dies. Antiochus III dies in 187. So we're at 187 BC now, trying to secure money for his debts. So he lets his two sons, Seleucus IV and Antiochus IV, they're real creative with their names. Seleucus, he becomes king, greatly raised taxes to pay his father's debts. He sends his general to Jerusalem to confiscate the temple treasury, recorded in 2 Maccabees 3. You want to share anything about that? What happens?
So he goes to confiscate the temple, all right. Mm-hmm. And he's really interested as well as making a mockery of the Jews. Josephus writes that he goes into the temple, sacrifices a pig on the altar, right, which obviously is an unclean animal. It wasn't one of the animals that God permitted to be sacrificed, in the tabernacle or the temple, and he controls it. And the Maccabean family lead this revolt, and Judah Maccabee means the hammer, and so Judah Maccabee goes in, basically fights back, kicks Antiochus out of the temple, reclaims the temple. And the miracle is that they find the lampstand, the menorah, in the tabernacle still burning for 8 days, that they were trying to retake this temple. And so from that will become the Festival of Lights, Hanukkah celebration. That's
right. It's so we have this situation here. Oh, that's right. Like, you know what I meant. There is something prior to that when that general comes down. The general he gets pushed off, and Maccabee in the Maccabees, 2 Maccabee 3 says that an angelic being intervened and kept him from doing that. Well, he went and he assassinates Seleucus, and then Antiochus IV comes to power, and what he just said there. Yeah. So Jason takes this defeat as an opportunity to regain position. That's when that rebellion starts to occur, and there is now a powder keg ready to go off. So finally, in this small village, Modine, northwest of Jerusalem, the king's troops are now requiring a sacrifice, and this is when this all comes about. The Jewish priest Matthias refuses, and a fight begins. He has 5 sons. They're joined by this group called the Hasidim, the pious ones, very passionate followers of the Jewish law. Their descendants will be the Pharisees and the Essenes, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. Well, Matthias dies, and his son, Judas Maccabeus, comes to power. The Hammer. That's a great name, man. That's if you want a little tag on your name. I mean, what's the one? The Impaler. What's the Vlad the Impaler. Yeah. This is as good right there.
Knowing my luck, I'd get like Scott the Feather Duster or something like that.
Yeah. Oh, so Judas Maccabeus becomes the leader of this revolt, and he uses guerrilla warfare to attack, and this goes on for like 6 years. He 166 to 160. He wins a lot of battles. Then, as Scott just mentioned, in 164 BC, they regain Jerusalem and the temple. They destroy the altar of Zeus. They cleanse the temple. The festival of Hanukkah is instituted to commemorate this. So Antiochus IV dies, and his sons now vie for power. His son Lysias offers religious freedom, and the Hasidim, they accept this offer, and they quit fighting, and they give him their support. Judas Maccabeus of the Maccabeans, now this is the second generation, he dies. His brother Jonathan takes the fight over. More fighting goes on. Finally, their surviving brother Simon takes over the fight, and he gains independence of all Judea and Jerusalem in 142. This is the first time the Jews have been free since 586 BC. Now, Simon is not of the high priest lineage, but he sets himself up as the high priest. And for the next 80 years, they will rule, his descendants will rule over Jerusalem. And this is known as the Hasmonean dynasty. So if you hear that term, this is what this was referring to. The Maccabeans, from the hammer all the way to him, they now will rule over. So this is the situation we find ourselves in. Simon has some sons. John Hyrcanus, Aristobulus the First, and Alexander Jannaeus. They all continue to gain territory of the reign, which is unbelievable that that's occurring. But I guess there's just so much else going on. When the son Alexander dies, his wife Salome, she ruled for 9 years. So now we're at 76 to 67 BC. So now we've covered almost 300 years. And she has a son, Hyrcanus II, that becomes high priest. This is where the Pharisees rise to power and form this Sanhedrin, this religious ruling group of the day that you will see all through the Gospels, all through the book of Acts. Actually, you see it. They talk about it more in Acts than they do in the Gospels. So here, I think, would be a good spot to talk about who's on there, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. If you've got some, if you guys want to talk about that.
Yeah.
I'll interject. It's estimated to have been 6,000 Pharisees during this time. So that's a lot.
Yeah, and in the in historical accounts too, you'll find that there are Pharisaism is a worldview. It's a
mindset.
Yeah, it's a mindset response to Hellenism, and these are going to be part of that Hasidim, the pious ones, right? That they don't want to embrace Hellenism because they believe that God is going to redeem them out of the hands of all of the people that have been constantly oppressing them to the extent you're obedient to the law. So if I'm embracing Hellenism, which is encouraging me to do things that the law prohibits,
Following the world.
well, then God's not going to be happy with that, and we're not going to find redemption. And that's what you see Jesus engaging with, a lot in the Gospels, because that's where their mindset is. If you knuckleheads, their citizens, would just stop sinning and be obedient, then God would actually redeem us from Rome, right? And so,
they're not the enemy,
right?
And that's I think we teach the Gospels. We always downplay them because Jesus is specifically reprimanding them because they've gone too far, but their intentions at the beginning are good. That it's beyond nationalism. We see nationalism.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah.
It's to the point of follow. They do not want what happened during Daniel being taken off, and
that's correct.
And then they don't want that to occur again. So they've set up this complex oral tradition to basically wrap around the law.
Yeah. That's the idea, is that if we can create laws that are more stringent than Moses's law, and we work to be obedient to the stringent law, well, then we're obviously never going to violate Moses's law.
That's exactly right. That's what their thought is.
Right. So there's about 3,000 of these, and they see it as kind of this fence around the books of Moses. And by the 2nd century AD, they'll get codified in what we know of today as the Jewish work called the Mishnah. So when you see Jesus talking about the traditions of your fathers, and you're more worried about those sorts of things, and
we're going to hit one of those this week.
Yes.
This week's podcast.
Yeah. What there are 39 types of work that's identified in this stuff, like different types of work to make sure you're not in violation of the Sabbath. Hand washing, right, which you would have saw in chapter 12 of Matthew. So there's all of that is their mindset, and you're right. They're often portrayed as like these villains, but that's the world that Jesus sets up shop in, because they're in Capernaum and they're in the Galilee, and that's where he goes.
So they set this oral tradition just as authoritative as the written law.
Yes.
And that's where the problem is. We talk about that. I can remember going to witness to a young man with Brother Gary, and the young man was Catholic, and he set up 2 circles, real simple. He says, "All right, you have a situation. We'll summarize. The Pope says this. The Word of God says this. Who wins? That's really what it comes down to. Who wins that argument? It should be the Word of God.
Mm-hmm.
It should be what God would have us to do, not some oral tradition or not some person, and that's what we have here. So, they actually were considered somewhat progressive because they believed in the resurrection, heaven, hell, angels and demons, which
spiritual,
those types of things. Which this then brings us to the Sadducees, which we would consider in today's world, we would consider them progressive, or we would consider them liberal, I guess is what we would say. So,
but the Pharisees, that's the irony. The Pharisees were considered the liberal ones in their day, even though from our vantage point we think, oh, you're the hyper conservatives.
Yeah.
I mean, it is different.
It's just a difference in terms.
And they're not, Pharisees and Sadducees are not like brothers in arms. They don't really like each other.
No, not at all.
The Sadducees,
Paul will use that to his advantage.
Yes, in Acts 23, right? The old resurrection grenade, and he slips out the back. But the Sadducees are basically going to be your ruling priestly party that exists primarily in Judea, in Jerusalem, because they're operating in and around the temple. They generally are controlling the Sanhedrin, the ruling council of the Jews. Politically, Pharisees are part of that, but Pharisees really
there's no appetite for that.
They're there for political reasons.
Correct.
Pharisees are politicians as well, but they're not like brothers in arms here at all.
So the Sadducees, you're looking at people that have bought into Hellenism to a certain extent. More, they're wealthy aristocrats, socially prominent. They want to keep their power.
Yes.
So like any politician, they tweak to stay in power. If we have the Seleucids in power, okay, I'd bend to them. If it's the Romans, I'd bend to them. Whatever gives me my power. So they're realists, I guess, for that, and they cooperate with the ruling powers to ensure national survival. Except during Herod's reign, we'll see more of that. So the common people supported the Pharisees over the Sadducees. They saw what was going to go on there. And the Pharisees will be the only ones that actually will survive after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So that's where we find ourselves. Jesus spends, like we just talked about, a great deal of time dispelling the oral traditions of the Pharisees, trying to get them to open their eyes. And many of them do. Many of them, Nicodemus is one, many of them come to know Christ, especially after we'll get to this at the end of the gospel, but when in the temple, the veil is rent in two. What's going on here? They start to put things together because they are people of the word. So
yeah, and the to me that was one of the big eye-opening parts is that when the temple leadership starts to become corrupt after the Maccabees and through some of the Hasmonean stuff, the Hasidim, they go up and they're going to settle more around the Galilee. And so like Capernaum, Bethsaida, Chorazin, like that's like your Ivy League of Phariseeville, if you will. But that's where that's where Peter and Andrew come from. That's where John and James are at. That's where it's either Philip or Thomas is from up that way. Like the initial five that he calls. So he's even calling people into his inner sanctum, if you will, Jesus is, that grew up in that mindset. And so they, not only is he dealing with the Pharisees, like the Nicodemuses of the world, but he's dealing with a people group that have grown up under that influence and that teaching. And then the Hasidim are going to split, and you're going to have some people that believe in redemptive violence, right? That we are God's assassination squad, and they're the zealots. And Jesus is going to call Simon the Zealot into his fold. They both are rejection of Hellenism in their minds, but they see
different ways.
Yeah, they see how they're conduits of God in different directions.
And we can see this throughout history.
But
it just keeps perpetuating itself.
Yeah. It's cool.
All right, so let's move the history. We got one more step of history here to bring us into where we're at. This is going to take us into Rome a little bit. So. Salome's death, her youngest son Aristobulus II, he challenges Hyrcanus' right to rule with the support of the Sadducees, and a civil war breaks out. Well, this civil war is at the wrong time. Hyrcanus is losing, so he reaches out to the Idumean or the Edomite governor, Antipater, or however you want to pronounce it. I've looked it up multiple ways. Whatever. That's also during this time, Pompey, Roman general Pompey, he has just conquered Syria to the north. Both he and his brother ask for aid, and Pompey decides to support Hyrcanus, and Aristobulus decides to resist. In 63 BC, Pompey marches on Jerusalem. He places Hyrcanus as the high priest, and he brings in Roman rule to the region. So now they're controlled by Rome. They've lost their freedom once again. He didn't do any damage to the temple. He does go into the Holy of Holies, but that's about it. So Hyrcanus becomes the high priest, and he sets up Antipater. How do you guys pronounce it?
Antipater.
Diadochi.
There you go. He sets him up as the unofficial ruler. Now, who is this guy? This is important. This takes us right up to the birth of Jesus Christ. So what's going on? What's going on in the West? Rome has risen to power, continuing to grow. A lot of social unrest in Rome because of the Senate. The governing bodies are abusing the poorer classes. So in walks three generals: Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, and they bring peace to Rome. And they sort of share this coalition. Well, Crassus dies, and now Julius Caesar and Pompey are vying for power. Pompey finally flees to Egypt. He gets killed by Ptolemy the 13th. Caesar follows him down there to Alexandria. Ptolemy the 13th, who's just a little boy, his sister Cleopatra is there, and this is the Cleopatra that we all know. Caesar and Cleopatra fall in love. She wants her brother's power, basically. So Antipater and Hyrcanus come to Julius Caesar's rescue because he's sort of stuck down there. He's trapped down in Alexandria. And for that, he becomes the procurator of the area and is given Roman citizenship. And he has two sons. Phasael, who gets Jerusalem, and Herod over Galilee. So some more fighting goes on. Julius Caesar is declared dictator, and he's assassinated for abusing his power in 44 BC. Mark Antony assumes control for a while, but Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew, is placed in power. He becomes Augustus. And there's this fight back and forth. Antipater is assassinated. His sons start to rule. I'm giving you a lot of stuff here. Eventually, we see some fighting going on between them. Aristobulus' son attacks and Jerusalem, and Phasael commits suicide. Herod quickly goes to Rome. Here's the big part. Herod quickly goes to Rome, pleads his cause, and he's made king of the Jews by the Roman Senate. And he returns with Roman armies to Jerusalem and retakes Rome in 37 BC. He executes Antigonus and any Sadducean supporters, and now he is ruler over Judea, Samaria, Idumea, Galilee, and Perea. So he has the majority of the power. There's a bunch of other stuff. Octavian and Antony fight it out. Augustus wins, and Herod switches his allegiance to Augustus, and Augustus brings in the Roman peace. And this is where we find ourselves.
This is where Matthew 1 comes in.
Yeah. So who is Herod? Herod is Herod the Great. He's the one we read about in Matthew chapter 1. This dude is ruthless, adept at changing sides and gaining power. He has spies everywhere. He's unbelievably paranoid. Mm-hmm. He murdered anyone that he suspected. He destroyed the Hasmoneans, who were ever left. Due to his Idumean ancestry, he was not accepted. He was an Edomite, so he wasn't accepted by the Jews. So he marries a Hasmonean princess named Mariamne. Mm-hmm. He eventually has her killed due to suspicion. He goes mad because of this, and he walking around his palace looking for him. And one time he's up near Caesarea, and in this madness, he grabs this woman that he thought was her, that looked like her, and she was a harlot, and she was diseased. And from that point on, he is diseased himself, which eats away at his body, makes him incredibly paranoid, which gives us some understanding then of why when the
he tells the
Magi come,
hey, tell me where he's at.
And he winds up killing all of those children. So some of that makes sense. So even I've got stories here. Even 5 days before his death, he instructed his son and heir to be executed. He's just a wonderful guy. And he dies in 4 BC.
Wonder where they go to lunch on Father's Day.
He has 3 sons that reign after him. We've talked about Herod Archelaus. He was the one that was there when they came out of Egypt, and he was ruthless as well. When the day he was inaugurated, he had 3,000 Jews slaughtered in the temple. And by 6 AD, so this is 2 years later, Augustus had him banished. And that from that point on, there is a prefect in Rome to control over the area. And that's where we get, later we'll get Pontius Pilate. He's I think the 5th one after that or something like that. All right, so that's a lot of history. Give us some things that are that fit in there that make us understand.
Yeah. So going back earlier to what Keith was saying about how all of these empires over time had built infrastructures and had things in place, and it's kind of making all roads, the phrases lead to Rome, but your scriptures are kind of saying they're all leading into Judea. There's a lot of just stuff that's happening. Well, Herod in his Idumean kingship, he controls the spice trade.
Idumean.
That's how I've always said. I don't know.
Yeah.
Idumea Nabatea, I think, is the other part of there, but it is Edom. Yeah.
Gesundheit.
Yeah. So he's in that spot. He's extremely wealthy. Like I've heard people say that Bill Gates would mow his lawn, like relative if you were to extrapolate the wealth and adjust for inflation and taxation and all that.
A few years.
Yeah, a couple years. But he's wildly influential then politically when he comes in, as we said, and he marries into the family, becomes king of the Jews, the Hasmonean family, and then kills them all. And then he has all of this money that he's using to keep Rome at bay. But that money ends up becoming what largely accelerates the corruption in the temple. Right, so when he ended the high priesthood that existed at the time, he auctions off the priesthood.
Yeah.
Annas, who you're going to run into in the Gospels, buys it. Annas is the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who both of them are Sadducees, by the way, with apologies to traditional passion plays and Easter cantatas. Caiaphas is not a Pharisee; he is a Sadducee. He is the high priest. That is in control of the temple that Herod has been using to fund and basically keeping kind of this triangulation between Rome.
Keep them at bay with taxes.
Yes, yeah.
And let him fill his coffers and build his cities. He built Caesarea Philippi.
Yep.
Names it after.
Why not? Yeah. Caesarea Philippi. And
builds Masada, all that kind of stuff.
I mean, he gives it to Caesar first. I mean, you don't want to be... But he does, to give it to himself. So when Herod dies, obviously he's got some sons that are going to take over, and they're going to have various points. Philip is who's going to, you ran into in Matthew 11 with John the Baptist. You'll get to him in Matthew 14, excuse me.
Yeah, we'll get to him.
Antipas is going to be the Herod that Jesus goes to before he's crucified, right? Archelaus only lasts 2 years, as you said.
Yeah, he's gone.
And then there's another guy that we're not told about,
No.
although it's interesting that somebody else already had his name, Aristobulus, and he has a son named Agrippa, which you run into in the Book of Acts. We won't. Can we say spoilers? They get on me in class when I was like, it's not like the Bible hasn't been around. The guy that gets I don't know if he ate too much Taco Bell, but like he gets some worms in his stomach, and you can go read that in Acts 12. And then Agrippa the second is who Paul will later run into later on in Acts. So they're going to be consistent characters throughout the rest of the Gospels for sure, and the Book of Acts. So really, when you think about like all of the stuff as you turn the page from Malachi to Matthew, you're also seeing other things that you hadn't seen before, and we do want to talk about some of that stuff, right? So.
Yep.
When they were in Babylon, the temple had been destroyed.
Correct.
So there was no centralized place of worship. When they come out, obviously they're on with Zerubbabel and Nehemiah. They've got building programs with the wall and the temple. But something that kind of starts to take some shape during the exile and then even on into the New Testament is this idea of synagogue. Now, the presence of God there was no Holy of Holies in a synagogue, right? There's no Ark of the Covenant. There's no presence of God literally dwelling there. There's no veil and all that sort of thing.
Yeah,
but
furnishings weren't there. It was more the teaching portion.
Correct. Yeah. Because Ezra is really working on getting the people to get back to the text. You recall in Josiah, his reforms that he kicks off are because they found the book of the law, just happened to find it, at the temple. Least place you'd expect to find the scriptures. But they find the scriptures, and that kicks off all these things. Well, they're as you said, like, never again are we going to go back into exile. So we're going to, as we talked about and how that influenced the Pharisees, we're going to not violate this.
It's one of the first times we read about, with Ezra, where he specifically sends Levites and priests, more Levites, to teach.
Yes.
Yes. Where we don't see that as much before. It's more about the sacrifices. Now we have learn the word of God. Not just read it, learn. What does this mean in my life?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, exactly. And so synagogues kind of become a place to centralize or synthesize, that. And not every synagogue was the same, again, depending on what the community had. But they often had some key elements. One is called Moses' seat, which you'll run into in Matthew 23, right? That's where they read through the Torah scroll once a year, and you had a Torah reading. And then you had what's called the Haftarah reading, which is 3 years you do everything else, right? And when you have Jesus in Nazareth standing up to read that's his family's day to read in the synagogue, that's what they're reading from. That was the Haftarah portion, because where he's reading out of Isaiah. So you have like this thing called Moses' seat. You have study rooms. You have what they call Torah closet. And again, it's a place to synthesize how do we continue to keep our community learning the scriptures and learning the Word of God. They have something called the chief seats. Jesus is going to chide the Pharisees that you love the chief seats and the upper rooms at the feasts. And the chief seats were supposed to be the places where your previous generation, what we may, say is the gray hairs, they were venerated. They were to sit in these seats in the synagogue so that the generations under them could look up to their model of faith. That was the idea. And so naturally, the Pharisees, they're the model of faith. So they want to sit in those seats. And I think about here, in my mind and in my life, there are chief seats. And Don Carr sits in one of them. Michael Minton sits in one of them, right? And Brother Preston. And like there are patterns of faith there that I want to look up to. And, they as they live for God, how can I live for God, in their shadow? And so, again, synagogues kind of become that place. They also kind of become a place where there's going to be more communal activity, up to and including, going in and getting some beatings if you were a bad boy. And Jesus warns that you're going to be scourged. He tells the disciples, you're going to be scourged in the synagogues, and they're not going to like it. So, so that when you come in to the New Testament and you see the synagogues, like that's kind of the mindset.
Where did those come from?
Yeah.
So it's formed during those 4 years. We also have another thing that comes about, which we get right in. You don't in the other Gospels, but right away you get it in Matthew. After the birth of Jesus Christ, we skip 30 years of his life, and we find ourselves then at this guy that we've heard about. He's been prophesied. This one in the wilderness speaking, and John the Baptist is on the scene, which we know he's related based on the Gospels as we read. But he's doing something that you're like, I didn't see this in the Old Testament. What's this baptism all about?
Yeah.
So go ahead and talk about that.
The closest thing you see in the Old Testament is before the priests would go and minister around the altar in the tabernacle, there was one of the pieces of furniture was the laver, right? Yeah. So it had a basin of water, and they would go in and ritually, ceremonially, you might say, cleanse themselves. And then they would go
very specifics on that.
Yeah.
The polished and the reflection and all that
yeah.
There's all kinds of symbolism that goes on with that.
It's one of those things where and I know you touched on this back when we got started, but don't just glaze over the detail. There's so much there that it's actually trying to demonstrate, even in the furniture. Right.
It's always pointing toward what we're going about to
Exactly. So, but you don't see that with the regular people. There were certain cleansing rituals that you had to go through, like if a woman gave birth or that sort of thing, but you don't see kind of this large-scale washing or baptism but yeah, you're thrown into it almost immediately in Matthew. And so during that time, there were kind of two ideas about baptism. One was the Pharisaical idea, which should be no surprise to us by now, right? We're going to be as clean and as obedient as possible, right? So in Matthew 12, for example, when they're getting after Jesus' disciples because they're not washing their hands, and that sort of thing, like hand washing, like all of that is a Pharisaical baptism. But there was another baptism. We mentioned the Essenes briefly earlier in passing. The Essenes,
John the Baptist was considered connected with them.
At least Essene influenced, for sure. Right. The Essenes were kind of the... So if you have the Pharisees and the Zealots that are the pious ones, the Essenes are like the hyper pious ones. In fact, they're so hyper about it. They go off into the desert, and they believe they are the sons of light, and everybody else is a child of darkness. That ought to, if you're familiar with the book of Colossians, when Paul tells us that we are children of light through Christ, there could be a poke there, but. In their world, people would come out to the desert. That's what they believe. They're going to come find the light. They're in darkness, so people will come out to us to hear the word. So yes, so John he's acting very Essene-like. If you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls,
same area.
Yeah, came out of Qumran, which is down by the Dead Sea,
near Jordan. It's all in that same region.
So that's like the Essene area, right? So John, when he's baptizing, you'll notice that there are Pharisees and Sadducees that are there, and they're a little miffed that he's doing this baptism, because the baptism wasn't about wash your hands before you eat or cleanse yourself before you go to synagogue. They would have baptism pools at some synagogues so you could be clean before you come in to engage the text. He's doing a different baptism, and he says, I'm baptizing with the baptism of repentance. And that's an Essene baptism. And the Essenes believe that when you came to a point in your life where you forsook your path for God's path, then you were baptized as a ceremonial display that you had forsaken your path for God's. Remember Jeremiah 6:16, ask for the old paths, for in them you shall find rest for your souls. When you've done that, then you go through that baptism. So largely that's what you see, and by the time you get into the book of Acts, you're going to see Christian baptism is largely an adaptation of that idea, right? That it's you're planting your flag as to whose side you're on. I've forsaken my path for Christ, and I'm not being baptized in order to get on that path. I'm being baptized because I chose by faith to walk that path.
Yeah, and Jesus, he tells them to specifically to be baptized. So we have here, this is an accept. How should I say that? It is promoted by the Lord. It is commanded by the Lord to do this at that point, as a picture of following Him, that you're on that path. So Christian baptism is this whole. Then we show the picture of it, and Paul fleshes this out for us later on in his epistles of the symbolism of this. We had a young lady baptized a week ago, and I'm on your side. And I love that. That's a great way of saying that. So, all right, we got one more subject I think we want to talk about, and Scott's done a lot of study into. So we find this. We do find this in the Gospels. We're going to really find this when we get to the book of Acts with Paul on the different schools. So you have these different sects that basically have shown up, and based on what camp you're in.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to talk Baptist circles, many times you'll hear, so what camp are you in? Are you follow after this line of thought, or do you follow after this line of thought? And I'll let you decide on those yourself. But we have some of that show up in the Jews, without a doubt, with these extremes between the Sadducees, Pharisees, and even within the Pharisees and Essenes and others. So go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. So again, there are different camps even within the Pharisees, and you may have heard of like Hillel and Shammai, and that was kind of one of the two famous schools or houses. Right? They're camps. It's the circle of thinking. Jesus often engages, with the debates on that. Matthew 19, when he talks about divorce, he's gonna. That is one of the 8 great Jewish debates. What can you divorce your wife for? Right? And I don't remember if it was Hillel or Shammai, but like one is, can you divorce them if they burn dinner? And I mean stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so he's obviously going to take the scriptural road on this, but I'll let you get there when you get there.
We'll get there this week.
Yeah. So but from that, when you were a kid, you were put in what was called Bet Sefer. Bet means house, right? So if you've been here through Brent's series on encounters with God at Beit El, Bethel, the house of God. So Bet Sefer is the house of the book. And Josephus says that they would write the word Torah on a slate, and they'd cover it in honey, and the child had to lick it off.
What?
And that they were eating, you were going to be consuming Torah, and that was your goal here.
Never heard that one.
The vast majority, though, didn't. Like, have you tried to memorize the first 5 books of the Bible?
Yeah.
And so
Could you imagine Leviticus?
Yeah, especially at ages when at that age. So they if you didn't cut it, they would say, hey, it's okay, kind of pat you on the head. You're not alone.
Go be a fisherman.
98% of you can't cut it either. Go home and apply your father's trade. And so if you could hang, then you would get to what was called Bet Midrash, which is the house of learning, and then eventually you're hoping that a rabbi or a sage, which is what they were called before then, would pick you up as a disciple. And so
it's a funnel.
Yes. And so like even though it's not the same thing in our world, like that was like your doctoral path, right? That was who was your academic advisor for your doctoral journey. So what you find then is, Peter and Andrew are out fishing. They're not at school, so they probably didn't cut it early on. And cultural context would suggest that the disciples themselves are probably fairly young, relatively speaking. They're
teenagers.
They're not middle-aged old men, or middle-aged or old men, but they are, because I'm there and I can't call myself that. So they're probably teenagers. James and John are not fishing by themselves. They're fishing with their dad. And this isn't just a Saturday activity. So
it's their livelihood.
They're probably not even bar mitzvahed at this point. So they could be a lot younger. Don't know. But I say all that to say that when Jesus shows up and he's calling these rejects from the schooling system, right? And that's not technically that derogatory as we would think of it. People that couldn't cut it. And that's what he's bringing into his inner circle. Like the picture of that for all of us. Because we're all people who can't cut it.
Yeah.
But yet that's the ones that he wants to bring into his circle. And you notice like James and John, when they leave, they're gone. They don't say, well, Dad, do you care if we go? Mom? Like, nope. They drop their nets and they get out. But the parents would have been just beside themselves, like overjoyed that their boys got picked up under a rabbi when they had no hope that would ever have happened because they weren't in the school system. So you see, again, this rabbi-disciple relationship, that these disciples are students. They're not supermen. They're not, they're not superheroes with Like we put them up on pedestals. You know, Peter's constantly putting his foot in his mouth, and
Yeah.
he's highs, he's lows.
Chapter
And
26.
but yeah. But they're students, and I think when we recognize that Jesus is trying to teach them what it looks like to follow the Word of God. It's not what the Pharisees are telling you it is. It's not what the Sadducees.
Right.
I'm going to teach you what it really looks like to walk the Word of God.
And slowly they get it.
Yeah.
And they fail. And slowly they get it. They fail. Yeah. Even to the end. And then finally the Holy Spirit comes upon them, and they have a constant teacher in their life.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
So.
I might throw one more thing in there as a bonus.
Oh boy.
Bonus in the bonus.
Yeah.
How long are we going? Oh, we're doing good.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
We have another hour at least.
No.
I think you're right.
I have to apologize. I can do it on camera because I've done this to you privately. So when he was here on, was our second guest, episode 30.
30.
Oh,
Yes.
Yeah.
When we record, there's an audio thing going on here that records. It starts at 1 hour.
Yeah.
I don't know why it starts at 1 hour, but it starts at 1 hour and we go from there. Well, I looked down and it says 2:15, and we still had time to go. And I forgot the one part.
We were still.
I
in
thought
Song
we
of
had been
Solomon.
going for 2 hours and 15 minutes, which, you know, if you've ever gone to a lesson that Scott teaches, that's not out of
Time
realm that
flies,
he
though.
would talk that much.
That's
Even
the
though I was
You were
talking more,
talking
I
more
was
than
talking
him.
more than him. But I got this whole nerve thing, like, oh my goodness, we gotta wrap this up, and I was pushing. So I apologize for doing that to you.
No.
It was.
The clock is merely suggestive anyway.
Oh no!
So,
Hey, that's,
You apparently have not pastored on a Sunday morning.
I'll give it away. So, the bonus that you had mentioned, the Roman peace. And I think that one of the other things that when the fullness of time was come, that God sent forth, Paul says in Galatians, his Son made under the law to redeem them under the law so that we might receive the adoption of sons. That fullness of time wasn't just the infrastructure of, roads. It wasn't just the change of political landscape, although that's a component too. It's not just the Hellenistic influence, but it's even in the gospel itself. There's a temple in Turkey, Priene, where they have found, it's called Augustus's calendar inscription. So Octavian, right, who becomes Caesar Augustus, there's this inscription where it talks about his birth being willed by providence, and that he coming in, so this is like from the Roman mindset,
Yeah.
he coming in had excelled all of our expectations, surpassing all benefactors, those that had come and those that we could hope to experience. And then it says, and that through his birth is the beginning of the good tidings to the world. And that word good tidings is where we get our word evangelism. Euangelion, evangelize. It's where we get the word gospel in the New Testament. And from a Roman perspective, they hallowed and really deified Caesar and Augustus, because it says when the birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of these good tidings. The Jews are living in a world where they're hearing this word gospel in relation to Caesar, the state, the political power that lives over them. And they're hearing the gospel of peace, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, right? That's the gospel that Rome has. And so when you've got the Jews now not just wrestling with how to walk the path of God, but they remember from Isaiah how beautiful are the feet of them which bring the gospel of peace. They're going to be like, wait a minute, this can't be Rome. This can't be the way that God does this. That doesn't make sense. But every day I'm just hearing this influence of the gospel of peace, this Pax Romana, that Caesar Augustus was the beginning of this gospel. And you have Mark, which you'll get to, right? Because
Yeah.
we're still in Matthew. He opens his gospel and wastes no time. And he says,
it is.
this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And so what I think, and this may color a little bit more especially when you get into the latter part of Matthew, right? We start getting into the trials and the crucifixion. To claim Jesus is God and his gospel, and it's not Rome, like that's political posturing. In Rome, you were an atheist if you didn't accept their gods.
Right.
Didn't mean you didn't believe in God in general.
You can believe in anything you want as long as you pinch
Exactly.
of salt towards Caesar.
When you, like, all of these other things that are there, hopefully helped explain like some of the things you're running into, but there is a larger narrative there that is politically charged, because anytime you say that Jesus is Lord, you're saying Caesar isn't, and you're making you're planting your flag where you stand,
which then directly influences the comments we read when he is speaking with Pontius Pilate.
Yes.
They ask him, are you king of the Jews? And he talks about his kingdom not being of this world and those types of things. So
exactly right. So
ties in together.
Yeah, gospel is not it's not a word that been invented by the scriptures, but it is a word that the scriptures are taking from that culture and repurposing it for where it truly lies.
Excellent.
You had a bonus, I think. I'm just trying to kill time.
Well, I hope that this has helped you. I hope this inspires you as you go through Matthew and as you go through the rest of the Gospels. But Matthew really brings in the Old Testament, and it's the one right after Malachi, and it's the one that we first see. So we wanted to do this in Matthew. But when talking with this, and I was actually in Scott's class for the co-op that's here on Mondays, and he was talking about this, and that inspired me to do my own research with it and my own studies. So I hope this also inspires you to do it, and I'm still doing it. That's why I haven't talked, because I don't understand it. I don't understand enough to teach it. But
don't get lost in all the minutia of every little name that we shared there. It is important to understand the basic flow of, here's this empire, and you've got this fighting between the two. You've got men being brought into power as high priests that weren't of the lineage. They're fighting against the incoming powers. So all of that plays into what we have here, and it sets the framework for when Jesus steps on the scene, the fullness of time. It has come. Everything is exactly as it needed to be in place. That's the cool part.
Yep.
Yes.
And I encourage you maybe go back, read or watch different parts of this. A simple version of this is that's done it really well is that Holman Bible Atlas. There's a whole section you can read through there that gives you a lot of the names and dates. There is church history in plain language. That's a really thick. If you want to, don't read it at night. You'll be asleep in 5 pages. But there's certain books like that'll be of help. Any other resources?
If you use the Life Application Study Bible in the Gospel of Mark, they have a chart breakdown of the Pharisees, Herodians.
Oh, really?
Essenes. Yeah.
Cool.
So that should be in there.
I didn't know. Leanne that's the study Bible she uses too.
Yeah.
So.
There's also. It's a little outdated, but it's still not bad. Alfred Escherheim, he has sketches of Jewish social life in the first century, the temple. He's again, it's an older work, but if you really want to get into some of that stuff, yeah. So Alfred Escherheim is one you could look at.
Very good.
Well, thanks for coming on, Scott.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
He's got a meeting to get to. We're in the middle of the day here today.
So thanks for coming on. I hope.
Tell work about Pharisees. Hope they like it.
Do we end with a joke, or we just do that on our normal ones?
Let's just do it on the normal. Do you have one?
Well, that was good. It's a riddle.
Oh, okay.
All right. So you're stuck in a completely enclosed box with a stick. How do you get out?
How?
You break the stick in half. 2 halves make a hole. You crawl out the hole.
Oh boy. With that, we will end. You guys have a great week, and hopefully this helps you out. Love you guys. Bye.
Bye.